Hello, War of the Ring players. Bihili back with more of my games from the 2025 World Tournament. This is the round of 32. I'm playing game two against Waldo. I'm sorry it's taken me a little while to upload this second game. My family and I have been traveling for the last several long weekends, and so two weeks between videos is longer than I intend to go in the future. But this is a pretty interesting game here. A lot of options for free people, which is the side that I'm playing. We have no balancing because there is no balancing in the first two games. If we do take it to a game three, there will be bidding. But in these opening two games where both players play each side, no balancing. So those first rolls and my cards are visible here. A pretty interesting first roll. I seriously contemplated both Aragorn and Dwarves to War here. I think if my opponent had rolled two eyes instead of one, I would have done it. Especially given that my opponent only rolled one muster here, so it's not like they're going to get Witch King turn one if I put something to war. I I always wonder what people do with these. If you have this roll and this card combination, if you have something like this, like if you have um, either a separate a fellowship separate that you can do with a palantir. Anytime that you can crown Aragorn turn one without giving your opponent a ring, it's really tempting. However, against one eye, it's hard not to just move towards the classic victory condition of the game, which is moving the fellowship, going for the dunk. So, given that I have a will, two other moves, plus a muster that can be used on book, which would be a move three for Strider to move down towards the Lamroth, and could be used as a move two for whoever I separate, probably Gimli, right? So the Fellowship could move here to Cardolan, and then another move three puts Strider down here in Druath, and puts Gimli here in Tower Hills, and then you can play Book of Mizarble to move Strider all the way to Dol Amroth and Gimli to Erd Luin, where if a companion is Erd Luin, activate the Dwarven Nation, move it directly to at war. So seriously thought about it, ended up, as you'll see, um, uh, I actually say as much as I want Aragorn, I also like you not getting a ring, which is me bluffing a little bit that I don't have book. Um, and my opponent contemplates how to make lemonades out of these lemons. I mean, this is a pretty good roll. If no musters is bad, two musters is great, but I mean, you've got three army dice. Three army dice is pretty good. I mean, if you'd give me two eyes, two musters, and three army dice, as shadow as my first roll every game, I'd be very happy with that. So my opponent ends up going with Saruman. So I think that's a very reasonable choice. I think in situations like these, like if I were in my opponent's position, especially seeing that free people only have the one muster, um, I would seriously consider putting the putting Sauron to war here and planning to bring this army with my four attacks in Barad-dûr, right? You can use those A dice and be super efficient, and you can go 1, 2, 3 with this army from Minas Morgul. With those other three, you can go 1, 2, 3, and then you have this. Well, you use the Palantir first to draw, but then you have an army. You have a full army right here, a full army outside Dimrildale, and depending on what your opponent does with this muster, you can decide if you want to use this sea dice to put Lórien under siege or to attack Osgiliath. And the reason that I might prefer attacking Osgiliath there, um, again depending on what your opponent does with that muster, is because then even if you only roll one muster next turn, um, you're guaranteeing yourself the Witch King. Whereas if you only if you roll one muster um, here, like if you roll one muster next turn, you're probably going to want to use it on getting Saruman into play, which means you can't actually make any attacks with Sauron still. So I think with this many attacks, I would probably err on going after Osgiliath. with the intention of, you know, basically hedging against a one muster roll next turn and still having an active Sauron presence on the board. So turn two, you can have Lorien and Minas Tirith or Lorien and Dol Amroth under siege and the Witch King, even if you only roll one muster next turn. Anyway, that's probably how I would play this set of dice. I don't actually remember what my opponent does because it's been 2 weeks since we played this game. So I move the Fellowship here and get hit immediately and get a 0 reveal. So, as you can imagine, in a tournament game, this is a pretty depressing start. Uh, I'm really wishing that I'd gone for Aragorn after that. Now, of course, we shouldn't be frequentists. We should be Bayesians in our statistical thinking about this game. Um, was moving here still correct? Yes. Does it feel bad that that is how it opened, given that I could have gotten Aragorn with this dice set? Yes. Both of those things can be true. Um, but yeah, I say beginning the game with the worst 2% chance is my mo. I mean, the chance of getting hit is only about 16% on that one move, and then given that there's 2 0 reveals in a 14 tile, no 16 tile pool, it is almost exactly 2% to pull a 0 reveal. It just feels bad. All right, so my opponent ends up thinking a little bit, and so they move up to here in Moranen, and so this does look like they're moving. They position an Umbar. I like this. I think some people will often with these 3 A dice like they would move Dol Guldur and Moria out, but I think Waldo likes to play the sort of classic elven pincer of Lorien and Woodland Realm, and holding those armies in Dol Guldur and Moria is smart because there are 3 reinforcement cards that can be played. Orcs Multiplying Again, Pits of Mordor, uh, or what's the one Shadows on the Misty Mountain, that can really bulk up that army that would be headed for Lorien. And so if you are sort of planning on playing the classic Elven Pincer, which I think is, especially with no balancing, like if your opponent, if you're the free people player and you don't have any muster tokens as part of bidding, the Elven Pincer here, where you go for 2 Elven strongholds, specifically Lorien and Woodland Realm at the same time, is usually highly effective. Uh, in a case where your opponent has muster tokens, it tends to be a little bit less effective. But holding those armies in place in Dol Guldur and Moria makes it more likely that you give yourself another turn to play Palantirs and just draw your start of turn cards to reinforce Moria or Dol Guldur before you go after Lorien. So I suspect that's what's going on here. I really like that play. I suspect that's what Waldo is thinking here as well. So you'll often see me, open similar to this, where I'll stack up an Umbar just to have a credible threat of Corsairs, and leave these 2 armies here in Moria and Dol Guldur in place. So all right, so I hide and I move. I miss that time. That's great. My opponent draws a strategy card. Not surprising. I go ahead and muster. I muster Gondor towards war, kind of assuming that sea die will be potentially used to move to North Ithilien. Um, but again, since I'm holding book, uh, I think what I'm trying to do with this is actually move my opponent north. Like I want that army to head towards the dew line because I'm holding Book of Mizarble. Now, I don't want them to get there super fast, but next turn my opponent's still only rolling 7 or 6 dice because they have to allocate 1 eye. So, are they really they have to roll a muster, and then they'd have to roll what? Even if they use the sea die to move to No Man Lands, they'll still have to roll 4 attacks to get into Erebor. So they need, that's you're starting to get into lower combinations of what's possible to get Erebor under siege if I do get to play Book next turn. So I by doing that muster of Gondor, I think a sort of autopilot play would be to muster the elves there, but I am kind of hoping my opponent will go towards the dew line. So I play that muster in Gondor to try to incentivize my opponent heading north. Which, as I said, he likes to play. I looked at some of his games. He likes to play this Elven Pincer. So I watched some of his games. Some of the logs he's uploaded from past games, and when he plays Shadow, he likes to go for this Elven Pincer. So he probably would have gone for it anyway, even without me playing this on Gondor, but anyway, that's why I did it. Fine. Yeah, and so he heads north. I draw through day and a night. Yeah, so 2 decent cards, but not super relevant. Okay, so now this is a really interesting roll. Okay, so my opponent had the situation happened where they got the 1 muster. So you probably want to spend that muster on um Sauron here. But if last turn that muster had been spent on Sauron, and that army that is in No Man's Land was parked in Osgiliath, I didn't roll a muster. So even if I'd moved Gondor to war, I wouldn't be able to muster without using that will. But do I really want to use the will for that? Probably not. So I think this is, a good example of why that attack into Osgiliath can hedge against these kinds of rolls. Because now, in my opponent's shoes, you're sort of in this position of, do I want to, get into Old Forest Road this turn with these attacks that I have showing, or do I want to get Saruman and not be able to actually attack with any Sauron armies this turn? So anyway, let's see what happens. So I move here. I think they're given that my opponent still doesn't have a minion in play. I think that there is a reasonable argument for doing a separation here. I could separate Strider into let's see, where could I? So I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I still have 1, 2. Yeah, so I could crown Strider um in Dol Amroth this turn and put the dwarves to war. I probably should have. I wonder why I didn't. That feels like it would have been the right move against 2 eyes here, and no, like, you're probably not getting Gandalf this turn. Wouldn't it be cool to go get Aragorn and put the dwarves to war, especially given that my opponent's already committed to the dew line? Isn't that what I wanted? Whatever, I move. And I lose Gandalf. I probably should have. I probably should have separated Strider there. Anyway, so my opponent asks to deny or not to deny, and I say, sounds like someone has a new Powers Rising. Because the only reason that you would put Saruman into play here with your opponent having a will showing is if you have a new Powers Rising and you want to get cheap Helm's Deep points. So actually, I think my opponent gave me their password. Just a second. Yeah, okay, so they do have it. I normally do this analysis without looking at my opponent's cards, but I think in this case, relevant. So my opponent does have a new Powers Rising. That's why they're seriously contemplating Saruman. All right, so they play Orc Patrol. Brutal. So I actually really love this play. I think like with the Fellowship hovered over Moria here. My opponent thought a while about this. I think this is right. You've got a 4 out of 14 chance because you've already pulled 2 tiles on 3 moves. You've got a 4 out of 14 chance of getting a reveal. That's not bad. Like, it's almost a third, 30%. Like, that's pretty good. You got to take those shots because, you know, yeah, I really didn't want to reveal into Moria there. I could have, I guess, but you know, do I really? I guess I have Bilbo Song and File, so it probably would have been okay. But being revealed into Moria on a tile drawing card when you don't have to just feels bad. So I do go. I do go high pass. I hide. My opponent keeps moving their armies along as we expected they would. How did this end up over here? Did I move that over there? All right, whatever. Hopefully I didn't just screw up the replay by doing that. So my opponent, yeah, moves all their armies into position. I go ahead and move again. Yeah, I mean, so I take a 2 reveal on an eye, and I'm up to 4 corruption. Like, was did that feel good? Like, did this turn feel good? Not really. The version of this turn where the dwarves are at war And yeah, I'm still only at step 2, but I've got a 5th die, and the dwarves are at war, and Aragorn's in Dol Amroth. Like, wouldn't that be better? Yeah. Anyway, so my opponent goes ahead and gets Saruman. I draw into Celeborn, which I'm very happy to see, given that my opponent has committed to Lorien. And I'm lucky enough to roll a bunch of wills here. Um, so I am going to get Gandalf now. I don't have any musters, which would be nice, right? Like, because since Saruman still isn't at war, I have time to bring in Gandalf, play Book of Mizarble, and use this other will to muster into Erebor, uh, and then use the sea dice to hide, the sea die to hide in Carrick, um, without my opponent being able to put Erebor under siege before I get a muster in there. So I go ahead and play Gandalf, and I think about putting him in Woodland Realm. Now, why, right? Um, there's some. If I had, I end up deciding to move him over to Grey Havens, but if I had Dane in hand, I would have put Gandalf into Woodland Realm, and the reason being, like, the Erebor is the farthest away that you can get um, from any of the Saruman mustering points. Why does that matter? Because in a siege in which Gandalf is in it, the way that Shadow gets any kind of leadership before turns, say, 6+ when you're in Mordor, where they can have the mouth, is with those Warg Riders, with the elites. So Erebor's a fairly safe place to put Gandalf and just hold a siege for the whole game. Now, in this situation, I would have had enough to just get one elite in there. And so, do you really want to risk losing your 5th die, especially because you went high pass, so crowning Aragorn's pretty hard? Do you really want to risk your 5th die on 7 hit points? Not really. So I ended up deciding to go Grey Havens. Uh, and um, oh, we have a little conversation about me having killed the die and then immediately moved Gandalf over to Grey Havens. My opponent didn't take any action or reveal anything in that time period, and he was kind enough to let me keep Gandalf over in Grey Havens. I would have been fine keeping Gandalf in Woodland Realm, um, but yeah, I ended up like changing my mind right after I killed the die, and you know the but my opponent was cool with it because he had been sitting there thinking for a while and hadn't done anything. So um, I yeah, go ahead and play uh, book as planned and so I'm fully prepared to use that will as a muster in Erebor, and I'm kind of assuming that with the dwarves at war, my opponent is going to attack Dale, and go for Erebor before it gets mustered up and becomes a nightmare. But instead, my opponent, I think probably wisely, continues to go for the elves. Especially given the dice that they rolled this turn, that allows them to perfectly get lined up here. They have all these Cs for they have 2 sea dice for putting these 2 um, strongholds under siege. They have that H die for bringing in the Witch King, and then they have 1 sea die left over to make an attack into Woodland Realm and get a cheap stronghold. And if I muster an Erebor, so be it. And so I think my opponent is basically deciding here that they're not worried that Erebor is just not going to be part of their points that they get this game. And I think um, with fighting Uruk-hai and A New Powers Rising, they're quite confident that they'll be able to take Helm's Deep. And so if you can grab a cheap Woodland Realm, a cheap Lorien, and a cheap Helm's Deep, which if in the Shadow player's hand, that's what it looks like they can do. Uh, that's 6 points, and then you just need to figure out where your other 2 are coming from a stronghold, and you can assume that you'll get something like Dale and Edoras or Dale and Pelargir or something like that. So, interesting. I think the instinct of Shadow here is to put Erebor under siege with book being played. But I kind of I like this play by Waldo, that he was like, nope, I had a plan, I'm sticking with it. Like, go ahead, muster up Erebor. I'm gonna take this cheap Woodland Realm and lock in my victory points. And like, if Erebor grows, so what? They're probably not gonna be able to take back Woodland Realm, even if no matter how much you muster. And fair. Uh, so yep, there's Witch King. Lorien gets put under siege. I hide the Fellowship. Woodland Realm gets put under siege. Now, the only other argument is like about putting Erebor under siege is that would have meant that my will got spent on mustering there instead of as a move, but now I get to spend it as a move because no pressure was put on Erebor this turn. So my opponent attacks Woodland Realm. They play Great Host. I play Confusion. Fine. My Confusion does a pretty good job. My opponent still gets 2 hits on the reroll, which is unfortunate for me, but those 2 ones are really nice because otherwise that would have if my opponent only got 1 hit on the reroll there, even with that Great Host played, that would mean that that Woodland Realm held for another turn, or at least another round of combat. And even weak strongholds like this, like their job isn't necessarily to hold because they're not going to. Their job is just to soak, to remove elites for downgrades that could be used in other battles, and to soak dice, right? Like the if it takes 2 dice to take down Woodland Realm, that rather than just 1, that's a good outcome for the free people here because you're not going to hold it. So really, all you're trying to do is slow it down. But instead, so I get 3 hits, which is pretty good. But again, doesn't really change the facts on the ground in the do line, which is my opponent doesn't really have enough to take Erebor, and I don't really have enough to take Woodland Realm back. And there we go. They top decked Corsair. So now this now Shadow has such a clear path to 10 victory points this game. Any game where in the first 5 strategy cards as Shadow you get Corsairs and a new Powers Rising, that's a game you should win. I mean, as much as we say that this is a skill game, yes, but like there's a lot of luck with the action dice and with the cards. And if you're Shadow and you get reasonable rolls and you've drawn Corsairs and a new Powers Rising in the first 3 turns, that's a game you should probably feel pretty good about locking up. So we draw new cards. I get my first scouts, which I'm happy to see. My opponent draws cards. Wow, that's another great top deck. That Nazgul Strike is great because now that you have your path to 10 and you know exactly where your 10 are coming from, all you really need to be thinking about is slowing down the Fellowship, and Nazgul Strike is a great card for slowing down the Fellowship. Okay, so my opponent. Oh, and I don't declare. And the reason I don't declare, I think it's sort of standard practice if you're out in the middle of nowhere to declare. The reason I don't declare is because I'm in Carrick, so it makes a bunch of cards unplayable. For a bunch of Shadow character cards unplayable, like all of the tile drawing cards and candles and things like that. So I don't declare out of Carrick because there are. Well, yes, that leaves me open to Nazgul Strike and Nazgul Search at the start of any turn. It also means that uh, uh, it also means that several Shadow cards can't be played, and there are more cards that are become unplayable by staying in Carrick versus cards that could hurt me by staying by staying by not declaring and dropping my movement to 0. So I start here with a muster. I assume folks can guess at what I'm going to do here. This is going to be a muster into Erebor, and the reason that it's going to be a muster into Erebor is my opponent, right? Like, could if I don't muster into Erebor, they could move out into Withered Heath and then put Erebor under siege with me only getting 1 muster in it. So I definitely want to get that first muster on the board, and then if my opponent doesn't move for Withered Heath, I'll find something else to do with that H. Obviously, I've thought strongly suspected for several turns that my opponent has had a new Powers Rising, but he's just not had a good way to play it. So what I'd really like to do with that H is protect Helm's Deep, because with an H to move from Edoras to Westamnet and then from Ford's Visor to Westamnet, I can use one of those C dice to then protect Helm's Deep. That's what I'd like to do. But an interesting play by my opponent here would be to threaten Erebor and force the use of that H. I don't remember if they do that or not. They put Southrons and Easterlings to war. Yeah, another reasonable choice. So I move, and my opponent puts Southrons and Easterlings all the way to war. The reason being that they have Corsairs, right? And so, what do we suspect that my opponent is planning to do here? You have one die that's available for Corsairs here, one of these C. Another C that's available for a New Powers Rising, or another P that's available for a New Powers Rising, another C, then a C that's available for Nazgul Strike to move all your Nazgul around. And those Nazgul can go down to Dol Amroth to kill it, they can go to Lothlórien to kill it, and then you leave yourself with a C and an A to put Helm's Deep under siege after playing a New Powers Rising. That's what I would do with these dice. I don't know exactly what my opponent does. And for what it's worth, I'm not sure that getting Southrons and Easterlings to war this turn was actually a priority. I may have considered using that H for something else, because if you put pressure on Erebor with a half move to Withered Heath, you know that Free People is probably going to spend that H reinforcing Erebor, which means there, you give yourself additional time as Shadow to go after Helm's Deep. You give yourself additional time, like that. Free People is not going to bring, Gondor to war to start mustering up in Dol Amroth this turn, right? So anyway, I don't remember exactly what happens, but I move, and my opponent now wisely. Oh, I thought this is when they play Nazgul Strike. They play Corsairs, so I would have probably played Nazgul Strike there. The reason being, you now hit on 4s, so you got a 75% chance of getting a hit. You want to move your Nazgul around, and then if you're now putting you're maybe taking a move away from the Free People. But I foolishly pass here. That's a mistake, because I know I want to use that third C die to move again, and there was no if like my opponent. I guess I just thought that if my opponent had Nazgul Strike, they would have played it there. So I feel like they don't have Searcher Strike because they would have prioritized playing one of those over Corsairs. But I maybe outthink myself here because my opponent does have Nazgul Strike. And they play it, and um, yeah, get 2 hits, pull a 2. I take a random. It's a Hobbit, and I'm pretty happy with that, honestly, because getting a Hobbit into Erebor is really nice. I think that there may be a possibility in this game that I'm going to either need to retake Dale, or uh, even though it's not super likely, try for a retake of Woodland Realm. So getting a companion on the board using one of my opponent's dice is nice here. Okay, so then now my opponent goes ahead and just attacks Dol Amroth. They get 0 hits. But these guys are cooked. I'm playing no cards because I don't have anything that I want to play. Celeborn's, I am obviously holding. Yeah, just these are such anemic combats. No one has rolled any hits for either of us. That's obviously worse for Shadow than it is for Free People there. So yeah, I didn't have a card that I wanted to play. I don't expect Dol Amroth's going to hold, so playing a card feels like a waste. And of the only real playable card is Celeborn, and given that Lorien is under siege, I want Celeborn to be used there. So I go ahead and move here. And again, one of the reasons why I should have moved rather than passed a couple dice ago, my opponent gets me on the reroll, right? So like, I gave them a third roll by waiting. I don't know what I was doing. It's just such a mistake. And I'm at least uh, almost into Mordor. That I just take as another 1 damage. I'm not going to take a random there. Can't risk Strider. I'm revealed, so I need his hide ability. Even though I have all these great healing cards, so I'm not super worried about corruption. I've got File, I've got Bilbo Song, I've got There Is Another Way, right? Like, this is either going to be a ring dunk or a military victory. Like, anyway. So my opponent attacks. They now use Many Kings and get 1 hit. So a total of 2. They press, and get their final hit. So they're now at they're now at 4. They still have a new Powers Rising in hand. They have Lorien under siege. So yeah, this game is looking pretty good for Shadow. Free People is a full turn behind. So seeing that they have uh, an A dice here, and knowing that probably what they want to do is bring this army. I suspect that what my opponent wants to do is bring this army up to Easterun and bring this army over to Lamadon. I go ahead and muster into Lamadon, and I muster another leader into Erebor. Again, still preparing for this idea that the Dew line may need to retake Dale, or may need to put pressure on potentially a retake of Woodland Realm. So, I do this to delay and especially because I have a scouts in hand, right? Like, which could be useful in Fords of Eisen, or it could be useful in Lamadon. Seems reasonable to play that. Another thing I could have done here, again, since I strongly suspect my opponent has a new Powers Rising, that H probably should have been played for Red Arrow into Edoras, with the intention of then moving a much bigger stack to Westamnet to protect against the attack into Helm's Deep that my opponent signaled was coming 3 turns ago. But that is not what I do. And so, yeah, my opponent would have moved into Lamadon for sure, but instead they consolidate into Easterun. And I pick up Imrahil a turn late. That's classic. Drawing Imrahil right after Dol Amroth falls is the quintessential Free People experience. So I ditch one of my blue zeros. I've got this blue 2. Do I really think that I'm going to have enough free character and Palantirs to play another tile? I do not. Given the pace at which the Shadow player military is moving, I think and that the Fellowship is still super healthy. I feel comfortable discarding that card. So yeah, I go ahead and hide. You'll notice that I hid with a muster, and I am considering, I'm probably thinking about using this Palantir to either play the blue -2 or one of these 2 cards. My opponent goes ahead and plays a new Powers Rising, and I move, and my opponent rolls double 6s, which doesn't feel good. But yet another hit of 1 damage. So you can see corruption here is starting to creep up. But again, I don't. It's not great, but I don't feel that bad about it because of the character cards that I have in my hand. That said, it's interesting that I just chose to abandon Helm's Deep here. I feel like I had to, given the dice that I rolled. Like, yeah, I could have used an H to move. If I use an H to move into Westamnet, and from Fords of Eisen, or into Westamnet, and then count on the Red Arrow to be able to let me retreat from Fords of Eisen, I'm then planning on using a ring to reinforce Helm's Deep. And my opponent only drew 1 card, right? They had no character cards at the start of this hand, so there's a 5% chance they drew Cruel Weather. But I still kind of, do I really want to be spending a ring on something that looks hopeless anyway? I don't know. Yeah, kind of grim. My opponent goes ahead and musters in North Dunland. So, yeah, I could have defended Helm's Deep here, but I don't. I just choose to let it die. And my opponent plays Shadow Lengthens here. Oh yeah, that's great. So they get a full stack in Orthanc and a full stack in Lorien. That's pretty nice. If you're Shadow, what else are you gonna do here? Are you going to go for Pelargir or Dale, or just? I mean, with those 2 sea dice, I would probably just go kill Helm's Deep. I would attack Fords of Eisen, I would attack Helm's Deep, and I would use the Palantir on fighting Urukai and just kill it. Before the Free People has a chance to draw Aum, or use that H to reinforce from Edoras. Yeah, and that's exactly what my opponent does. So, yeah, and I decided that getting some of these blue tiles in the box was more important to me than trying to defend Helm's Deep. The other thing this lets me do is muster again, but like I also reserved that H die because if my opponent had flown all the Nazgul up to Lórien, I could play Celeborn. Yeah, so my opponent does exactly as predicted, right? They had 2 attacks and a Palantir left, and that's the perfect combination of cards to just go blow up Helm's Deep, which, yeah, it doesn't matter. Helm's Deep just explodes. So my opponent's now at 6, so they need 1 more stronghold. So I'm really counting on Lórien to hold here. It is also the free people experience to draw an Ents card immediately after Helm's Deep falls. So my opponent allocates an eye, and I mean, with this roll, like, I'm sort of suspecting at this point that I'm not going to get another turn. It's looking pretty grim. There's a possibility that Lórien could hold, but I really do need Lórien to hold here. My opponent has plenty of attacks. It's also pretty likely that I'm going to give them a ring to keep moving if I can, because there's only 1 eye in the box. So I just want to, run up Mount Doom. And so I move another 1. Again, this is just sort of like drip, drip, drip of damage to the Fellowship. And my opponent's thinking, and they drew Cruel Weather right after I got in. So that's the Shadow player experience. Like, just so quintessential. Drawing Immerhill immediately after Joel Amroth falls and drawing Cruel Weather the turn after 3 people get into Mordor is so classic. So my opponent puts pressure, decides to go for Adoros. I think that makes sense. I hide. They bring in Mouth of Sauron. And I defend Dale. I like that. Why? So what I really wanted to do here is make my opponent spend 2 dice taking Polar Gear, rather than just spend 1 taking Dale. And the reason for that is, like, if you look at what my opponent has here, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attacks left. So there's 1 committed to Edoras, 1 committed to moving the Nazgul around, right? So now that leaves my opponent with just 3 attacks. So that means that they have to take Lórien in 1 shot. So I don't necessarily think Lórien will hold, but I do think it's possible that Lórien will make it through 3 rounds of combat. Given that I have a confusion, I have a shield wall, I'm going to play this to get more hit points into it. And then I have this heroic death if I need 1 more, although I'd prefer to keep that, obviously, because the corruption's creeping up. So the reason for choosing to defend Dale here is purely one of, I didn't want my opponent to have the option to have 2 attacks and therefore more cycles and therefore 4 rounds of combat with an additional cycle rather than 3 rounds of combat in Lórien. That was the whole reason that I did it. Maybe it should have been used to, hide or something. Oh, I changed my mind. No, I don't change my mind. I just do a slightly different distribution of. I do a slightly different distribution because I don't want to leave Erebor vulnerable to those 2 stacks. Yep. So my opponent moves up to, because I know that this muster is allocated for Celeborn, so I don't want to leave Erebor exposed to one of those stacks. That makes sense. Yep. I go ahead and play Celeborn. And I get another playable card, right? Like, that's, especially given that my opponent has some Saruman units in here. Why? Pretty reasonable to suspect that you'll see a Devilry of Orthanc. So first card of the game, yeah. Well, it wasn't my first card. Wasn't Book my first card? I don't remember. Anyway, so my opponent attacks. They use a C card. I play the Confusion here. Given that they very intentionally put 7 leadership in here, maybe it was knowable that the first card was going to be Cruel as Death. Probably could have intuited that, but whatever. It ends up working out well for me. Both Confusions did 2 hits back to my opponent, and they only get 1 hit from that Cruel as Death. So I get 3 back because of Confusion. And so now my opponent chooses to press, but it's 8 hit points against 6 hit points here. So I'm in a much better position than I was in for for um, for Lorien Holding, and I sort of assume that I'm going to see a Devilry here because since my opponent doesn't have that many hit points left, I don't suspect I'm going to see a Desperate Battle or a Deadly Strife because that could very easily just wipe out their whole army, and then they can't take Lorien this turn. So I'm expecting to see a Devilry, so I play my advantageous position here. It runs into a Relentless Assault, which is great in this situation. Because is my opponent really going to take hits? No, they don't. And so Waldo gets 2 6s. I only get 1 back. If Lorien had been hitting a little harder here, I've only rolled 2 hits on 10 dice. You'd expect 1.5 more than that. And 1.5 more casualties against this army is a pretty big deal. An extra 1 hit, not so much, but an extra 2 hits means that elite doesn't exist. So, for the free people rolls. Actually, I don't even know what the rolls are. They're actually completely even. Um, interesting. My opponent puts a red tile in. So by putting this red tile in, my opponent has essentially given up on winning this turn, which I think is fair. Although it does open them up to me potentially dunking next turn. I only need if I use that sea die to move again this turn, I only need 2 moves next turn with Aragorn, with Strider, and a ring. I only need to roll 2 moves. And so I think my opponent, seeing what cards they have in their hand, none of them playable in Lorien, correctly decides that what they need to do here is try to slow down the Fellowship, and rather than go for the win this turn. I think that's correct. And so now, like, we can see what the impact of them not getting that additional, having the option to do an additional round of attacks and do another round of cycling on Lorien is. Because after that first attack, my opponent could have stopped if I hadn't defended Dale, right? Because they would only need the 1 attack to then take Dale. So anyway, these rippling consequences of these micro decisions, we've talked about those in previous games, but it's always a theme. So my opponent now takes Edoras. They get no hits, but I go ahead and run away. Better for that army to be alive and in fold than dead, was my thinking there. So I pass. My opponent recruits into Moria. The other thing by recruiting this with this army instead of fighting it to the death is in the event my opponent did have something like Shadows Gather, they can no longer use this army to reinforce Lorien. So I've kind of locked these units in place by retreating into fold rather than continuing to fight a hopeless battle in Edoras. All right, so I move, I draw 3, and I thought about this for a long time. I was pretty sure that Lorien was going to fall next turn because they have another muster here. That'll probably be another one in Moria. They're probably going to roll 3 attacks, and then Lorien is just dead. If this becomes a 6-3-7 army, and so given that Lorien is probably dead, and Pelargir will probably also be a target, I feel like I don't have 2 more turns. And since I don't have 2 more turns, I feel like I need Strider's Hide ability. And so I take a random, and I get the Hobbit. And that sucks. What I really wanted was any of these 3. Like, honestly, I would have been fine with Strider being a random there, too. So 80% of the draws 60% of the draws I was super happy with. 80% of the draws there I was totally fine with. That was the one thing I didn't want, because now we have a corruption problem on our hands. And in no way did I ever think this game was going to become a corruption game, but here we are. Very similar to last game, where I was playing Shadow as pure military, and then it accidentally turned into a corruption game. I feel like the same thing has happened for my opponent here. He hasn't really been focusing on corruption. He made a couple key plays, like with Orc Patrol around Moria and stuff, but he hasn't really been playing corruption cards. But the hunt was very effective. He pulled 8 tiles before Mordor. and yeah, and now and it's just been sort of a steady drip of ones that have made it not possible to efficiently lose companions. So I now have, sure, effective one corruption, but like candles could just outright kill me. That doesn't feel good. So um my opponent chooses to go into Lamedon with the mouth ability. Also fair. Because they are correctly Waldo knows that Dale is not impossible, but Polar Gear is obviously much easier. Um, so, uh, so my opponent allocates one eye here. Oh no, they allocate two. I think that's pretty smart. I think there's even uh, you maybe even allocate three here because if you then do something like roll like that, one move kills me if I pull an eye. So now looking at these dice, it doesn't look good for the free people here because there are so many combinations of cards where my opponent can simply take Pelargia here with this C. And then they still have these two as moves if they need them to get this army from Moria and Lothlórien. This die for attacking Lothlórien. And then if they have anything like Half Orcs and Goblin Men or Shadows Gather, they can be much more efficient with how they do that. So, I'm looking at these dice and kind of assuming that I have lost because if I move and hit an eye, I'm just dead. So I decide the only reasonable thing I can do is play Bilbo's song, which I think is correct. Uh, I need to if I move here and hit an eye, I need to not just outright die. Um, my opponent puts another eye in the box. It doesn't feel good. And so, it was this smart? I don't know. Uh, maybe so what I was doing here was recruiting into Pelargir, knowing that my opponent is planning to take Pelargir, and I still have um, the option. Like I need to move once, so I don't take corruption, and then that leaves me with uh, a a C to move out to Osgiliath, and then a ring to attack into Pelargir. So I go ahead and get a leader into Minas Tirith and that regular into Pelargir, um, assuming that my opponent will no card into Pelargir because they want to use their cards for attacking into Lothlórien. And that all was correct as far as predictions go, except my opponent rolls 2 hits. So, you know, not great, and I roll 0 back. So I'd put those units in Pelargir, hoping that you know I, I would go from a 33% chance for a hit to about a 50% chance for a hit, so that I'd get at least like I was trying to get one. And I assumed that my opponent would get, they're expected on sixes, rolling 6 dice to get about one back. So I was hoping to trade hits there, and then get rather than the other option was just to recruit an elite into Minas Tirith. Um, but I felt like the extra leadership for how many rounds of combat we were probably going to have in Pelargir, plus you know maybe getting to take one out of the attacking army from Lamedon. Like a world in which I have 3 in Osgiliath and my opponent has 6 in Pelargir, and then I'm trying to retake Pelargir with this army from Minas Tirith. That's a very different probability of that out. The probability of winning that battle in Pelargir is just fundamentally different, right? So if if I have that plus one, so if I'm at 6-1, or if I'm at 5-1-2 against 6-1, I'm in great shape to potentially retake Pelargir, and then I don't have to count on Lothlórien holding. The worst case outcome, which is what happened, is my opponent gets 2 sixes and I get no hits back. So it just means that the Pelargir battle here is now not good. And this is what we talk about in the chat. So I go ahead and move, and yeah, sure enough, it's an eye. Not unreasonable. There were 5 of them in a there were 6 tiles that were really bad for me and 6 tiles that were pretty good. The -2 would be great. The 3s, honestly, would be great. Um, A zero, but even any reveal would have been okay. But you kind of know what my dice are allocated for the rest of this round. Um, and of course now because I go straight up to 11 corruption here, I have to take Strider or I just lose. If I take a random there, I lose. Um, and I'm just kind of assuming my opponent has, you know, candles or mortal wound. Fortunately for me, they don't. But now they go ahead and Shadows Gather, uh, and yeah, I do exactly as I had planned. I put more protection into Dale because my opponent can't take Erebor this turn with only 2 dice left. But yeah, this Osgiliath fight like doesn't look good. Um, and so my opponent moves Nazgul around to now protect Pelargir, which is fair, and I feel like I've got to go for it anyway. So I play an advantageous position, and my opponent plays Dread and Despair. Fair enough. I get a hit anyway. That's very lucky. My opponent gets 0. Um, so that's the start I needed. So now it's 6 hit points for free people and 2 leadership against 6 hit points and 4 leadership. So not great. Um, but I do have Immerhill and I have Heroic Death. So I have 2 Heroic Deaths even. I really do feel like I need that one for healing, but um, I know I have to retake Pelargir here. So I go ahead and play the Shield Wall, and I get 0 hits. Um, and my opponent gets 4. So, uh, you know, so much for that idea. And so I stop. Like, you know, uh, the probability of Lorien holding, even the thing that feels particularly bad about that is that 2 cards that could have helped Lorien hold I just spent on trying to retake Pelargir. Um, but I basically decide that the probability of um, me living through 4 rounds of combat in Lorien is higher than the probability of me retaking Pelargir with a 302 against a 604. I think that's a reasonable calculation. So I stop. Uh, and my opponent attacks. I play a Heroic Death, sure, fine. And I get 4 hits back. Um, so this is why you take your chances, right? My opponent has 3 on the reroll or on the post and completely misses. And I say I would have preferred my roll down in Pal, but I'll take it for sure. Yeah, I mean, I would have preferred those 4 hits down in Pelargir. But, not bad. My opponent presses, gets 1 hit. I get 1 back. They get 2 on the reroll. So I am now down to just two units. My opponent only has 4 dice, no cards left. And my Heroic Death is no longer playable. And man, those cards that I spent down in Pelargir would be really great to have right now. Uh, my opponent now presses with just 3 dice left. So now the game has, even if I survive this, like it's not clear how I win. Like if my opponent just puts 3 eyes in the box, I die if I move. I can play There Is Another Way, sure, to heal one, but like, this hunt pool is not looking good. Even if I survive this, but I don't. My opponent needed 1/6 on 6 dice, and they got it, which is not unreasonable. Um, very well played by Waldo here. I think he took his opportunities where he had them. As mentioned throughout, there's a couple minor things I would have done differently, but this was a very efficiently played Shadow Military game. He got the cards he needed, and he used them well. Um, and uh, and got a little bit of help from the hunt to make it so that I couldn't just sprint up Mount Doom because I had a corruption problem on my hands. And part of the reason I had that corruption problem was because of my own bad choices, like not taking Strider to the 3, etc. So, I think that I think that this is one of those frustrating games because there is an alternate universe version of this free people game that is winnable for free people. There are some games where like no matter what you do as free people, you're just going to lose. I don't think this is one of them. I think I could have played this differently and maybe eked out a victory here. Um, again, this is the like skill versus luck version of this that skill versus luck conversation about this game that people have all the time. Um, But I think I made a couple minor misplays here. I think Waldo played very well. Um, and yeah, it led to a pretty convincing Shadow military victory. If a version of this game where I crown Strider on turn 1 or 2, we have a very different game on our hands. But I chose not to do that. And yeah, I I don't feel great about it, as mentioned, about how I played this, and a few things I would have changed. But on to game three, um, and I'll be uploading that game three video. We actually just played it this morning, so I'll be uploading that game three video hopefully in the next couple days when I have time to record another one. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.